The Horizon Cafe, a sophisticated coffee shop in an upscale neighborhood, was owned by Linda Parker. Linda had taken over the cafe after her father passed away, a man whose ideas of who belonged were rooted in exclusion and prejudice. She had inherited not just the cafe but also her father's beliefs, even if she never fully understood them. To her, keeping the cafe exclusive was a way of maintaining its class and standards, or so she thought. One afternoon, Arthur Williams, an 82-year-old black veteran, entered the Horizon Cafe, hoping to have a peaceful meal. He had spent years serving his country, and all he wanted was a simple moment of tranquility in this neighborhood he had once fought to protect. Arthur's military jacket was adorned with medals that told the story of a life full of sacrifice and bravery. Linda watched him from behind the counter, her expression skeptical. She had been taught to think that people like Arthur didn't belong here. Arthur found an empty table by the window and sat down, enjoying the warm sunlight streaming in. He smiled at the waitress, Anna, who approached with a menu and a cheerful greeting. But before Arthur could order, Linda walked over, her expression turning cold. "I'm afraid we're full today," Linda said, her voice clipped and dismissive. Arthur looked around the cafe, clearly seeing several empty tables. He met Linda's gaze, his voice calm but questioning. "It looks like there are seats available. I'd just like a cup of coffee and a slice of pie, ma'am." Linda's jaw tightened. "We reserve the right to refuse service," she said, her tone firm. The room went quiet as patrons turned their attention toward the scene, the lively atmosphere replaced by a tense silence. Arthur paused, taking a deep breath. He had faced prejudice before, but each instance still brought a sting. He could feel the weight of Linda's words, the deliberate exclusion, and it took him back to memories he had long tried to forget. Moments during his service when he had been treated as less than by the very people he fought to protect. He had endured it then, and though it pained him, he had the strength to endure it now. "I see," Arthur finally said, his voice even. He began to rise from his seat, his gaze steady on Linda's. There was no anger in his eyes, only a quiet sadness and the dignity of a man who had experienced far too much of the world's cruelty. "Thank you anyway," he added, his voice carrying a grace that seemed to hang in the air even as he turned away. The silence in the cafe was thick, the tension palpable. Anna, the waitress, stood frozen, her eyes wide with disbelief. She had always admired Linda for her business acumen and her ability to keep the cafe thriving, but this was a side of her boss she had never seen before. She felt a pang of shame on Linda's behalf and an urge to speak up, to say something, anything, that might make this right. Before Arthur could make his way to the door, a voice broke through the silence. "Excuse me, sir," came a woman's voice from across the room. Claire, a local schoolteacher, had been sitting at a nearby table with her young niece, Ellie. They had watched the interaction unfold, and Claire could not let it end this way. Claire stood up, her niece looking up at her with wide, curious eyes. "You can join us," Claire said, her voice kind but resolute. "We'd love to have you." She smiled at Arthur, gesturing to the empty seats at her table. Arthur hesitated, taken aback by the unexpected kindness. He glanced at Linda, whose face flushed with a mix of anger and embarrassment. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Linda opened her mouth as if to protest, but something in Claire's expression stopped her. It was not a look of defiance, but rather one of disappointment, a silent plea for Linda to reconsider, to see the humanity in the man she was turning away. Arthur looked at Claire, then at Ellie, who gave him an innocent, hopeful smile. Slowly, he nodded. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, his voice softening. He walked over to their table, and Claire pulled out a chair for him. Ellie beamed up at Arthur, and he couldn't help but smile back, feeling a warmth he had not expected when he first walked through the cafe's door. As Arthur sat down, the tension in the room began to dissipate, replaced by a quiet sense of solidarity. Anna moved quickly to bring over a fresh menu, her hands trembling slightly as she placed it in front of Arthur. "I'll be right back with your coffee, sir," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but there was a note of sincerity in her words that made Arthur nod in appreciation. Linda stood there for a moment longer, feeling a strange mix of emotions. There was the instinctive defensiveness, the ingrained belief that she was protecting something important, but there was also a gnawing doubt, a sense that perhaps she had gotten it wrong. She looked around the cafe, seeing the other patrons watching her, their expressions ranging from discomfort to quiet judgment. And then she looked at Arthur, now seated with Claire and Ellie, his demeanor gracious despite the way he had been treated. Something shifted within Linda at that moment. She felt the weight of her father's legacy, the narrow beliefs he had passed down to her, and for the first time, she questioned whether they were worth holding on to. Was this really the kind of place she wanted the Horizon Cafe to be? Was this really the kind of person she wanted to be? Without saying another word, Linda turned and walked back behind the counter, her mind racing. The lively chatter of the cafe slowly resumed, but Linda felt disconnected from it, lost in her thoughts. She watched as Anna served Arthur his coffee, as Ellie giggled at something he said, and as Claire smiled warmly, making him feel welcome. Linda knew that she had a choice to make. A choice about the kind of environment she wanted to create, about the kind of legacy she wanted to leave behind. And as she stood there, watching the scene unfold, she realized that perhaps it was time to let go of the past and build something better, something that truly represented the values she wanted to stand for. Claire, a local schoolteacher, was sitting nearby with her 8-year-old niece, Ellie. They had come to the upscale part of town for a special treat, enjoying a rare afternoon together. Claire watched the exchange between Linda and Arthur, feeling a wave of discomfort. She had known of Arthur. He was a well-respected member of the community, a man who had given so much. She could not just sit and watch this injustice unfold. Claire glanced at Ellie, whose wide eyes were fixed on the scene. Without hesitation, Claire stood up and approached Arthur's table. "Excuse me," she said, her voice clear and steady. "Mr. Williams, you are welcome to join us. We have more than enough room." Ellie, with her innocent curiosity, added, "You can have my seat if you want, mister." She smiled up at Arthur, her kindness untainted by the prejudices that lingered in the air. Linda stood there, her face flushed. She wasn't used to being challenged, especially not in her own establishment. "This is my cafe," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I decide who stays and who goes." Claire looked Linda in the eye, her expression determined yet kind. "Linda, this man has done more for our country and our community than most of us ever will. He deserves respect, not exclusion." Linda hesitated, feeling her father's voice echo in her mind, telling her who was deserving and who was not. She glanced at Arthur, who had begun to rise from his seat, not wanting to cause trouble. But something in Claire's words, and in Ellie's innocent, genuine smile, struck a chord deep within Linda. Arthur looked at Claire and Ellie, then back at Linda. He could see the conflict in Linda's eyes, and he knew all too well the weight of inherited beliefs. He had seen it many times before, people clinging to outdated ideas because it was easier than confronting them. But in Claire's eyes, he saw hope, and in Ellie's smile, he saw the future, a future that could be different. Linda shifted uncomfortably, the tension between what she had been taught and what she was seeing now tearing at her. The cafe had always been her father's pride, a symbol of his success and his values. But looking at Arthur, standing there with quiet dignity, and at Claire and Ellie, offering kindness without hesitation, Linda felt the weight of her father's legacy begin to crumble. "Please," Claire said, her voice softer now, almost a plea. "Let him stay. This is a place for everyone, isn't it?" Linda swallowed hard, her gaze shifting between the three of them. The cafe had gone silent, every patron watching the scene unfold, waiting to see what she would do. She could feel the judgment, the unspoken disapproval, but also the hope that maybe, just maybe, she would make the right choice. Slowly, Linda's expression began to soften. She took a deep breath, the words catching in her throat for a moment before they finally came out. I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She looked at Arthur, her eyes meeting his, and for the first time, there was no skepticism, no defensiveness, only regret. "Please, stay. Have a seat. I'll get your coffee and pie." "On the house." Arthur paused, taken aback by the sudden shift. He could see the sincerity in Linda's eyes, the vulnerability of someone trying to change, even if it was difficult. Slowly, he nodded and sat back down, a gentle smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice filled with a grace that seemed to diffuse the tension in the room. Claire let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, and Ellie beamed, clapping her hands together in delight. "Yay! Pie for everyone," she said, her innocent joy breaking the tension and drawing a few chuckles from the other patrons. Linda turned and walked back to the counter, her hands still trembling slightly as she reached for a coffee cup. Anna, the waitress, gave her a small, encouraging smile. "You did the right thing," Anna said softly, her voice filled with genuine warmth. Linda nodded, though her heart was still pounding. She felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, fear, and a sense of something shifting inside her. She had always prided herself on running a tight ship, on maintaining the standards her father had set. But now, she wondered if those standards had been wrong all along. Anna quickly prepared Arthur's order and brought it over, placing the steaming cup of coffee and a slice of pie in front of him. "Here you go, sir," she said with a smile. Arthur looked up at her, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you, young lady," he said, his voice gentle. As Arthur took a sip of his coffee, the cafe seemed to come alive again. The patrons slowly returned to their conversations, the tension that had gripped the room dissipating. Claire and Ellie chatted happily with Arthur, and soon, the sound of laughter filled the air once more. Linda watched from behind the counter, her heart heavy but hopeful. She knew this was only the beginning. Change was never easy, and she had a long way to go to undo the damage her father's beliefs had caused. But as she looked at Arthur, Claire, and Ellie, she felt a glimmer of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, she could make the Horizon Cafe into a place where everyone truly felt welcome. And perhaps, in doing so, she could find a way to let go of the past and build something better, not just for the cafe, but for herself as well. Linda took a deep breath and stepped out from behind the counter. She walked over to Arthur's table, her steps hesitant but determined. "Mr. Williams," she said, her voice soft but steady, "I hope you'll come back again. I'd like to hear your stories, if you'd be willing to share them." Arthur looked up at her, surprise flickering across his face before it softened into a warm smile. "I'd like that, Miss Parker," he replied. "I'd like that very much." Linda nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. It wasn't much, but it was a start, a step toward something better, something more inclusive. And as she turned to walk back to the counter, she felt lighter, as if a burden she hadn't realized she was carrying had begun to lift. The Horizon Cafe, she realized, could be so much more than her father's legacy. It could be a place of community, of connection, of courage, a place where everyone, no matter who they were, could feel at home. And that, Linda thought, was a legacy worth building. Linda watched as Arthur gently thanked Ellie and Claire, preparing to leave, but then she found herself speaking up. "Wait," she said, her voice softer now. "Please stay." She looked at Arthur, her eyes meeting his, and for the first time, she saw not just a customer but a man who had lived a life of courage and sacrifice. "I'm sorry," Linda added, her voice cracking. "Please, let me get you a coffee, on the house." Arthur paused, studying Linda's face. There was sincerity there, a vulnerability that hadn't been there before. Slowly, he nodded and sat back down. The tension in the room began to ease, replaced by murmurs of relief and approval from the other patrons. Linda turned and walked back to the counter, her hands shaking. She nodded at Anna, who smiled and quickly went to get Arthur's coffee. Claire returned to her table, giving Linda an encouraging nod. Ellie beamed, happy that the man had decided to stay. As Arthur sipped his coffee, the cafe gradually returned to its lively self. But something had shifted. People were kinder in their conversations, more aware of those around them. Linda stayed behind the counter, her thoughts racing. She knew this was a pivotal moment, not just for Arthur, but for her too. She could continue as her father had, holding on to outdated beliefs, or she could choose to change. Linda watched as Anna served Arthur his coffee and pie, her warm smile easing the tension. The sight of Anna interacting with Arthur, treating him with the respect he deserved, made Linda realize the depth of her own prejudices. She had spent so long upholding her father's values without questioning them, without ever really seeing the harm they caused. And now, in this small but significant moment, she had an opportunity to do things differently. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision before her. She could sense the eyes of the patrons on her, some curious, others judgmental, and yet others hopeful. She knew that whatever she chose would set the tone not only for her cafe, but for her own future. This was about more than just a cup of coffee. It was about who she wanted to be and what kind of place the Horizon Cafe could become. Linda stepped out from behind the counter once more, her steps purposeful. She approached Arthur's table, feeling her heart pound in her chest. "Mr. Williams," she said, her voice steady this time, "I want to thank you for staying. I know I didn't treat you right when you first walked in, and for that, I am truly sorry." Arthur looked up at her, his eyes softening. He could see the struggle in Linda's eyes, the genuine desire to make amends. "Thank you, Miss Parker," he said quietly. "It takes courage to admit when you're wrong." Linda swallowed hard, nodding. "I'd like to invite you back," she continued. "I want the Horizon Cafe to be a place where everyone feels welcome, and I would be honored if you would come again." She glanced at Claire and Ellie, who were both watching with encouraging smiles. "You all are always welcome here." Claire smiled warmly, nodding in approval. Ellie, sensing the importance of the moment, clapped her hands together. "Can we come back tomorrow, Aunt Claire?" she asked, her eyes wide with excitement. "Mr. Williams can tell us more stories." Arthur chuckled, a genuine smile spreading across his face. "I'd like that," he said, looking at Linda. "I'd be happy to come back." Linda felt a sense of relief wash over her. It wasn't going to be easy, and she knew there were many more steps to take, but this was a beginning. She looked around the cafe, seeing the patrons return to their conversations, their expressions softer now, and she felt hope. Hope that she could create something different, something better. As she walked back to the counter, Linda felt lighter, as if a burden she hadn't realized she was carrying had started to lift. She caught Anna's eye, and the young waitress gave her an encouraging smile. Linda smiled back, grateful for the support. The Horizon Cafe had always been her father's pride. But now, Linda realized, it could be so much more. It could be a place where everyone felt welcome, where the past did not dictate the future, and where people could come together in kindness and understanding. And that, Linda thought, was a future worth fighting for. The bell above the door chimed as new customers entered, and Linda greeted them warmly, her heart still racing but her resolve firm. She was ready to make the Horizon Cafe into the kind of place that her father had never imagined. A place of openness, acceptance, and community. And as she watched Arthur, Claire, and Ellie chatting and laughing at their table, she knew she was on the right path. In the weeks that followed, Linda made her choice. She decided to transform the Horizon Cafe into a place where everyone, regardless of background, felt welcome. She started by attending community meetings, events she had always ignored before. She wanted to learn, to understand the diverse community she had never truly embraced. Arthur became a regular at the cafe, always greeted warmly by Anna and, eventually, by Linda herself. She would often sit with him, listening to his stories about his time in the service, the places he had seen, and the hardships he had endured. Linda began to realize how much she had been missing by shutting people out, by keeping her father's narrow vision alive. The cafe itself underwent changes. Linda invited local artists to decorate the walls with paintings that celebrated diversity, vivid colors depicting scenes of unity, progress, and hope. She added a community board where people could post events, services, or simply words of encouragement. The Horizon Cafe was becoming more than just a place to get coffee. It was turning into a community hub. Word of the changes at the Horizon Cafe began to spread, first through the neighborhood, then throughout the town. People came not just for the excellent coffee and pastries, but for the atmosphere, the sense of belonging that Linda was fostering. And then, something unexpected happened. A local journalist wrote a story about Linda's transformation, about how a single moment of realization had led to a ripple of change. The article painted Linda in a new light. It described how the Horizon Cafe, once seen as an exclusive, upscale establishment, had become a beacon of inclusivity and warmth. The story featured interviews with regular patrons, including Arthur, who spoke about his experiences and how Linda's willingness to change had affected him. The article was shared widely, and soon people from all over the town, even beyond, wanted to see the cafe that was making a difference. Linda was surprised by the response. She received letters and messages from people she had never met, thanking her for what she was doing, for taking a stand, and for choosing a different path. It was humbling, and it reinforced her decision to continue on this journey. The Horizon Cafe was no longer just her father's legacy. It was becoming her own, shaped by her choices, her courage, and her newfound understanding. One day, Linda hosted an event at the cafe, a community appreciation day. She invited people from all walks of life, offering free coffee and pastries, and encouraging everyone to share their stories. The cafe was filled with laughter, conversation, and the sound of new connections being made. Linda watched as Arthur spoke to a group of young people, their eyes wide with fascination as he recounted stories from his time in the military. She saw Anna chatting with an elderly woman who had brought a handmade quilt to display on the community board. The atmosphere was vibrant, full of life and warmth. Linda found herself standing beside Claire and Ellie, who had, of course, come to support her. Claire smiled at Linda, a look of pride in her eyes. "You've done something wonderful here," she said. "This is what community looks like." Linda felt a lump form in her throat, her eyes misting over. She looked around the cafe, at the faces of people who were no longer just customers but friends, neighbors, and allies. "I couldn't have done it without you," Linda replied, her voice thick with emotion. "You helped me see what this place could be." Ellie tugged on Linda's sleeve, her eyes shining. "Miss Linda, can we have more of these days?" she asked, her voice filled with excitement. "I like it when everyone is happy." Linda knelt down to Ellie's level, smiling warmly. "Of course, Ellie. We'll have lots more days like this. This cafe is for everyone, and I want it to always be a place where people feel happy and welcome." Ellie grinned, and Claire squeezed Linda's shoulder, a silent gesture of support. Linda stood up, her heart swelling with a sense of fulfillment she had never felt before. She knew there was still work to be done, that change was an ongoing process, but she was ready for it. She had the support of her community, and she had the courage to continue moving forward. As the day drew to a close, Arthur approached Linda, his eyes twinkling with warmth. "You've made something special here, Miss Parker," he said. "This place, it's not just a cafe anymore. It's a symbol of what can happen when people open their hearts." Linda smiled, her eyes glistening. "Thank you, Arthur. That means more to me than I can say." Arthur nodded, then gestured around the bustling cafe. "This is what we fought for," he said quietly. "Not just freedom, but the chance for everyone to belong, to be seen and heard. You've made that happen here." Linda felt a wave of emotion wash over her. She reached out and took Arthur's hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "I couldn't have done it without you," she said. "Thank you for giving me the chance to make things right." As the evening wore on and the cafe slowly began to empty, Linda took a moment to herself, standing by the window and looking out at the street. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the neighborhood. She thought about her father, about the values he had held so tightly, and she knew that while she could never change the past, she could choose a different future. The Horizon Cafe had become a place of transformation, not just for Linda, but for everyone who walked through its doors. It was a place where people could come together, where differences were celebrated, and where everyone was welcome. And as Linda stood there, watching the last of the day's light fade, she felt a sense of peace. She had made her choice, and it was the right one. The Horizon Cafe was no longer just a business. It was a community, a symbol of hope, and a testament to the power of change. Linda was invited to speak at community gatherings and even on local news segments. She shared her story honestly, about the prejudice she had inherited from her father, about the moment she realized she could do better, and about the people who helped her see that change was possible. She spoke of Arthur and Claire, of Ellie and the kindness that had broken through her barriers. Her words resonated with many, and soon the Horizon Cafe was not just a local favorite but a symbol of positive change. Linda began to host charity events at the cafe, inviting people from all walks of life to share their stories. She used her platform to highlight issues that mattered: inclusion, respect, and community support. Arthur, who had once been turned away, was now a beloved guest of honor at these events. He would sit in his usual spot by the window, sharing stories of his service, and people would listen, captivated by his wisdom and resilience. Linda had created a space where voices that were once silenced could be heard, where every person felt valued. One Saturday afternoon, Linda organized a fundraiser for a local veterans organization. The cafe was packed, the energy buzzing with excitement and purpose. Arthur was there, of course, his presence lending a sense of gravity and warmth to the event. He spoke about his experiences, not just the hardships but the camaraderie, the friendships forged in the most difficult of times. People listened, some with tears in their eyes, others with expressions of deep respect. Linda watched from behind the counter, her heart swelling with pride. She saw how Arthur's stories touched those around him, how the connections being made went beyond just a shared space. They were creating something lasting, a community built on understanding and compassion. She knew that this was what she had wanted all along, even if she hadn't realized it at first. As the event went on, Linda was approached by a young woman named Maria, who had recently moved to the neighborhood. Maria spoke softly, her eyes full of emotion. "I just wanted to thank you," she said, "for what you've done here. I've never felt so welcomed in a place before. It's like you've made room for all of us." Linda felt her throat tighten, a rush of emotion threatening to overwhelm her. She reached out and took Maria's hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "Thank you for saying that," Linda replied. "That's exactly what I hoped for. This cafe belongs to everyone." Maria smiled, her eyes glistening. "It really shows," she said before turning to join the crowd, her heart visibly lighter. As the evening drew to a close, Linda stood at the front of the cafe and addressed the crowd. "I want to thank each and every one of you for being here today," she said, her voice steady but full of emotion. "This cafe has changed, and so have I. And it's because of all of you, because of the stories you've shared, the kindness you've shown. Together, we're making something beautiful." The crowd erupted in applause, and Linda felt tears prick her eyes. She glanced over at Arthur, who nodded at her, a proud smile on his face. He raised his coffee mug in a silent toast, and Linda did the same. The Horizon Cafe had grown into something far beyond what Linda had ever imagined. It was no longer just a business or a place for coffee. It was a space for growth, for understanding, and for connection. Linda knew there would always be challenges, but she also knew she had the strength and the community to face them. And as she looked around the bustling cafe, filled with laughter and conversation, she felt a profound sense of fulfillment. This was what her father had never seen. The power of opening doors rather than closing them, of embracing rather than excluding. The Horizon Cafe had become a beacon of hope, a place where people could come together and feel like they truly belonged. And that, Linda thought, was the greatest success of all. One day, as Linda looked around the bustling cafe, she saw a young boy approach an elderly couple at a table. The boy struck up a conversation, and soon, the couple's faces lit up with joy. It was a small, simple moment, but it represented something much larger. The breaking down of barriers, a glimpse of a future where kindness and understanding prevailed over prejudice. Jack returned to Arthur's side, gesturing towards the lively scene. "This is what it's all about," he said softly, his voice filled with pride. Arthur nodded, his heart full. "To unexpected friendships, to second chances, and to new beginnings," Arthur said, raising his coffee mug in a toast. Linda watched from behind the counter, tears welling in her eyes as she saw the transformation that had taken place, not just in her cafe, but in herself. She lifted her own mug in silent agreement, her heart swelling with hope. The Horizon Cafe was no longer just a business. It had become a symbol of resilience, unity, and the belief that change was always possible. And as Linda stood there, surrounded by friends, neighbors, and strangers who had become allies, she knew that this was only the beginning. Together, they were creating a community where everyone felt they truly belonged. As the evening went on, The sun began to set, casting a warm golden light through the cafe's large windows. Linda stepped outside for a moment, breathing in the crisp evening air. She looked at the sign above the door, the Horizon Cafe, and felt a deep sense of peace. This place was now more than just her father's legacy. It was hers, built on the values she had chosen to uphold: acceptance, understanding, and love. When she walked back inside, she saw Arthur still sitting with Jack, both of them laughing over some story from years past. Claire and Ellie were sharing a slice of pie at their table, Ellie's giggles filling the air. Anna was behind the counter, chatting warmly with a couple who had just moved to the neighborhood. It was a scene full of warmth and life, and it filled Linda's heart with a deep, abiding joy. She picked up a rag and started wiping down an empty table, her eyes drifting back to the scene. It struck her that the most significant transformations weren't the big, sweeping gestures, but the small, everyday acts of kindness, the willingness to reach out, to include, to care. And she knew that as long as she held on to that, the Horizon Cafe would continue to be a place of belonging for everyone who walked through its doors. Linda smiled to herself, her heart full. This was, indeed, a new beginning, for the cafe, for the community, and for herself. And as she looked around at the people who had made this journey with her, she knew that the future was bright, full of promise, and built on the simple but profound belief that everyone mattered.